Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome back to Clearer Than Truth. I'm host Nathan Kiker. Our guest today is Declan Walsh, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and Chief Africa Correspondent for the New York Times. Declan brings an essential on-the-ground perspective to international crises, covert warfare, and shifting regional alignments. Declan, welcome to Clearer Than Truth.
Good afternoon.
You have a unique perspective as the Chief Africa Correspondent for the New York Times. I think today most of our listeners spend a lot of time thinking about the conflict in Iran, the conflict in Ukraine with Russia, but Africa's overlooked. I know that's a bit simplistic, but what role does Africa play in the current sort of global order today? And then what role will it play in 20 years, 30 years?
I think it probably plays a much bigger role than people appreciate right now. Even just on the conflict front, certainly Gaza and Ukraine have dominated headlines for years now, but the conflict in Sudan rivals either of those conflicts in some metrics in terms of scale, people involved, even the death toll. And that's a war that we've been following very closely at the Times for some years now. There are access considerations and constraints. It's hard to get there. It's difficult to report on. There are good reasons, I think, why it's been overshadowed. But I think there's got to be other, there's other reasons also why, the world has sort of turned away from a conflict that has produced an enormous death toll, enormous suffering and now threatens to engulf an entire region. But, Africa, as the cliche goes, is not a country. It's 54 countries, depending on how you count it. And while, conflict is certainly an important factor in some parts of the continent and regions, in other areas, they are, I would say, bounding ahead, or certainly have acquired a new geostrategic importance. I think part of that is around the issue of demography. While the rest of the world is aging and facing into the challenges of a future with older shrinking populations, Africa is still growing and extremely young. We did a series a couple of years ago centered really on both the promise and the peril of this astonishing demographic change, which is really summed up in a couple of statistics. By 2050, the population of Africa will have doubled from now. And at that point in time, Africans will account for 1 in 4 of all people on Earth and 1 in 3 of all young people aged between 16 and 24. So that just really gives you a sense, even just in pure demographics, about, how Africa is changing and how its relationship with the world and its importance to the world, I think, are shifting dramatically.
I want to come back to Sudan in a minute, but I think we'd be remiss not to look at this from the U.S. perspective of the last 25 years in Africa in total, especially Northern Africa. Our entire focus has been in just counterterrorism. Famously, bin Laden and even like Carlos the Jackal were not from Sudan, but based in Sudan throughout the 90s. And if we're looking back over the last 25 years, what did our approach to, and again, you can't really say Africa at large, but let's say North Africa, Sudan, and some of the more troublesome countries, where did our approach go wrong? Did we get anything right in our approach to sort of the trouble spots?
Let's stick with Sudan just for a second. Certainly, as you said, Sudan became notorious for its connections with Osama bin Laden and people like Carlos the Jackal many years ago. And those connections led to a punishing American sanctions regime on Sudan that went on for decades, was only lifted about 5 years ago, and arguably had some very serious, and negative repercussions for the country, even as it tried to sort of change into a more democratic dispensation. On the other hand, it's hard not to think about how the place that Darfur in particular occupied in American policymaking just 20 years ago. At that point, we had a genocide that was declared and ongoing in Darfur, and we had celebrities like George Clooney leading marches down the Mall in Washington, and we had that whole issue of the Darfur genocide and the war really at the highest echelons of policymaking priorities in Washington. That unfortunately is a really striking contrast with the kind of attention that has been paid to a similar situation in the same country right now, where we also have what's been declared by human rights groups and even the UN as a likely genocide that's underway yet again in Darfur, albeit for different reasons, and this conflict that's just tearing apart this enormous country. So I think there's a lesson in there somewhere about how America, and I would say the Western world's priorities more broadly have evolved over this period. I think, at that time, I think about when I was growing up, and I think, I grew up in Ireland. A lot of what we knew about Africa at the time was, in retrospect, I think a little paternalistic. It was really seen as a place of famine and war, a place that was deserving of our sympathy and our pity and charity, I would say. I think these days, people, the outside world's understanding of what makes Africa tick has become a lot more nuanced. I think it's influenced by considerations like access to minerals and what Africa can offer, as well as African countries can offer as well as take. But by the same token, I think our attention spans have really diminished, and I think we've just got a lot less time to really understand what's going on. And unfortunately, I think that is trickling down into policymaking and the amount of resources that are dedicated to helping to solve African problems. When that war in Darfur was on 20 years ago, and there were other conflicts in Sudan that the US helped to mediate, notably that led to the secession of South Sudan in 2011 as a separate country. I was listening recently to another podcast that was looking at the history of that moment and pointed out that, at that time, the American envoy in charge of helping with that mediation had a staff of up to maybe 50 people at some point. In recent years, I've dealt with American envoys helping on the conflict in Sudan, and sometimes they've been struggling to get a couple of people from the State Department to help them out.
That, I think, most people would be alarmed by, but just because the U.S. seems to be paying less attention to it doesn't mean that other powers are not. Russia, for example, Wagner has a huge presence in the region. The UAE is obviously flexing muscle as well. Who are the driving forces today behind both that conflict and just North Africa writ large?
This is my second time being based in Nairobi. And when I came back here about 5 years ago, I had a bunch of conversations, including with diplomats and others, about what were the likely what was the likely focus that my reporting was going to take thematically. And at that time, a lot of the conversation was about US versus China. Mm-hmm. This competition between these two behemoths on Africa, resources, minerals, and other things. I got to say that I don't want to diminish the importance of that. I think it still is very important. But as a storyline for us journalists, it's really under-delivered, I would say. And instead, that space has been filled by what I would call the rise of the middle powers. We see countries, in particular from the Gulf, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, but also Turkey, to some degree, India, really kind of rushing into the space that the United States has vacated to a large degree here in Africa, in the search for mineral resources, in search for commercial opportunities, for the ability to build ports, strategic ports, all around the continent. And that really is probably the most striking geopolitical change that I have seen over the last 5 years that I've been based here. That these Gulf countries in particular have become very powerful forces in commercially in Africa, but also in terms of some of these conflicts and the way that they're playing out.
You obviously have alluded to they want ports and they want access to some of the rare earth metals and whatnot. Who will win? What sort of middle power will win Africa?
You can certainly see a sort of descending league table of who's most influential or active right now. I think, by any measure, at the top of that table at the moment, certainly in terms of the most active countries, is probably the United Arab Emirates, followed closely, I would say, perhaps by Turkey, maybe by Qatar in some parts of the continent. Who's going to come out on top just really depends on by which metric you're measuring that success. I would say that in terms of commercial opportunities, that's really provided a huge impetus for the development of the continent in some places. It is changing the politics of the continent as well. We see African leaders who are showing far more, agency and a willingness to stand up to the traditional powers than they did in the past. In a country like Kenya here, countries like the United States, Britain, maybe the European Union, they were kind of the big dogs diplomatically for many, many years. To some degree, they have receded in recent years. And now we see the Kenyans and other neighboring countries turn to the Gulf countries for financing, for investment, for other forms of direct support, particularly, of course, as American aid has been hugely curtailed in the last year. And so we see, one lever that the United States had at its disposal, even as these sort of middle powers were rushing in with more money to invest, the US could say, well, at least we have a relationship with the government through providing aid. But now, of course, that has also been diminished.
I want to talk a bit more about the gap that's being filled by the withdrawal of US aid. What are you seeing on the ground? Like, what are the real world impacts from less aid from the US? And the aid that these countries are getting from these other middle powers, what sort of terms and conditions are coming with their support?
I'll point to two examples that I've seen firsthand over the last year since US aid was dismantled. They've been in particularly stark impacts in Sudan and in Congo. I was in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, back, I think, in March of last year. And at that point, there was this network of soup kitchens, which was being run by a very courageous group of local volunteers, which were effectively providing the only form of sustenance that most residents of this sort of war-torn city could access. It was too dangerous for most regular NGOs to work there, so the soup kitchens were doing the work. But a lot of the funding and the support for that food that they were able to buy was coming from the West, and certainly particularly from the United States. When that funding stopped overnight back in February, March of last year, the impact was discernible on the ground immediately in Sudan. I went to some of these places where I met people who told me how food kitchens which had been in operation had stopped, and those which had struggled, had kept going, were at a greatly diminished capacity. And, that there was a very stark and measurable impact there, just in terms of people who said, that they just had less to eat, or sometimes nothing to eat. Maybe they didn't get that meal every day that they were getting. The other place where I've seen it play out on the ground, I think, even though the impact's a little harder to measure directly, has been in Congo. I was in eastern Congo in May to cover this Ebola outbreak. The Ebola outbreak, which had just been declared. And over there, it's now turned out that outbreak had been underway probably for 5 months before it was officially, detected and declared. And that is an extraordinary gap in epidemiological terms for the detection and declaration of an Ebola outbreak. Most previous outbreaks have been detected in a matter of weeks, and that plays a crucial role in fighting against the disease. In this case, the aid community or the humanitarian community and the Congolese government were, way behind the curve. And when I spoke to aid workers, they said that one of the, I think there are several reasons for that, but certainly one of them is the fact that the US previously, supported surveillance efforts. The CDC was very involved in the DRC, and more broadly, American aid was supporting a network of local NGOs, not just for health but also for other humanitarian assistance. And that when this, so there are two problems. One is the outbreak was declared too late, and then once it was declared, that network of NGOs that previously could have been mobilized to provide a timely response to the outbreak just wasn't in the same condition that it had been. And so the tools that were available to combat this this incredible outbreak weren't there. And, right now we're seeing to some degree the fruits of that already. This is the largest Ebola outbreak that Congo has ever had. It's the second largest after the 2014-2016 outbreak in West Africa. And frankly, it's quite possibly already the largest, even though that hasn't been detected. I know the WHO says that the current figures for people either infected or killed in this outbreak are probably an undercount by a factor of 4, which would already, after 4 or 5 months, put this outbreak at the same level as the one a decade ago in West Africa, which took 2 years to play out.
Yeah. I think most Americans, because they are, I shouldn't say it this way, but they're myopic and they simply think, keep USAID so that they can give money to Africa so they don't become terrorists. That is a very elementary way of saying it. But how has the retreat of U.S. help sort of changed how the average African views the U.S. so far? Are they truly incentivized to want help from these other middle powers, or did they see China and Russia and, as you mentioned, Saudi and Turkey as being better potential long-term friends?
Well, these middle powers aren't offering much by way of aid. It's not like they're stepping in to fill the gap left by USAID. Almost nobody is. That's part of the problem. Yeah. What they are offering are commercial opportunities. In some ways, it's a very, it's a slightly, if I can use the word Trumpian, it's a transactional approach that they're offering. Mm-hmm. They're saying, we're going to come to your country. We will invest. We will create jobs. We'll spark the economy. There are certainly many people I meet here who are, excited by the opportunity that political leaders like dealing with countries who are treating them as equals, or, where they've got something to negotiate. African leaders, as I said, like being able to sort of window shop between allies, which is what a lot of them do now. And, one country might take the Chinese for infrastructure, might use Russian mercenaries to put down an insurgency in part of their country, and might still take some assistance from the United States where it's available for healthcare or other things. So, I don't detect that ordinary citizens in these countries are so tuned into where the funding is coming, but they certainly know if there's investment, if there are jobs. And, honestly, that gets to one of the huge looming threats in some of these parts of Africa that are most stricken at the moment. And it's a combination of the fact that you have these surging youth populations, but very low levels of employment, and young people who are incredibly frustrated, looking for opportunities, sometimes looking for a way out. We saw those scenes recently of people scrambling across the border from Morocco into Ceuta, the Spanish territory at the northern tip of Africa. So we see a really toxic combination in parts of the continent of surging populations, low employment opportunities, relatively low quality education. And I think that's really what is in many ways, posing a threat, if not for the immediate future, certainly looking beyond the next 5-10 years.
Well, the Arab Spring was kicked off when a 27-year-old Tunisian man who ran a food cart set himself on fire because he was frustrated with a lack of economic opportunity. Is it different now at all? Has there been any progress in terms of advancing opportunity for this next generation, which is larger than ever? Or is it still sort of stuck in where it was circa the Arab Spring?
I used to be based in Cairo before I came here, and so I have some familiar. I've been to Tunisia, Libya, many of those northern countries. Just to turn to Tunisia briefly, it's a bit of a tragedy. Tunisia was the one country in the Arab Spring which for many years really seemed to be succeeding, where others had fallen into chaos, like Egypt and so on, or into political repression. And now we really see, the leadership in Tunisia taking a hard turn to the right and really being very oppressive. But the big change that I do see across the continent is that, there is an upswell of restlessness and a desire for change among young people. The old kind of ideological tram lines of the Cold War and so on, left versus right, those are not there anymore. But we have seen in a number of countries, like in Madagascar, in Morocco itself, and here in Kenya, we've seen these what have been sort of loosely termed as Gen Z protests. And that's this, new, younger generation, which are better educated in many cases than their parents were at that stage, but they're just frustrated by the lack of opportunity. And crucially, I think they are frustrated at the failures of the democracies, even in their own countries. And that's why, if you look to, let's turn to West Africa for a moment, we have a sort of coup belt of countries in the West where the military has taken over in recent years. I don't think it's any coincidence that these are countries with very high birth rates, large rest of youth populations. These are areas that are straining under the effects of climate change, and also where you see young people very strikingly sometimes supporting these military coups when they happen, because they're just tired with the old order. They feel that even though they may have voted, it didn't deliver any meaningful change in their own lives.
Do you think it's safe to say that the global response, specifically the U.S. response to the Arab Spring, was a failure in terms of not providing structural change in democratic governments that could actually open opportunities for this generation? It seems that nothing really improved over the last 15 years.
I mean, so much about the Arab Spring was determined by the politics in these countries. Like I said, I used to live in Egypt. I arrived there in 2015, which was really when the Sisi government really began to tighten the screws, really turned the Muslim Brotherhood into a complete pariah organization, mass imprisonments, and also curtailed personal freedoms of ordinary Egyptians to an extraordinary degree, actually, and that continues, I think, to this day. There were places where I think those revolutions or those uprisings did have an opportunity to bring real and lasting change. The US did try to support, for instance, in Sudan, where we had one of arguably the last uprising of the Arab Spring was in Sudan in 2019, when Omar Hassan al-Bashir, the leader of 30 years, was overthrown in these incredible street protests. This scenes, I was there, these scenes that were just so inspiring. And suddenly, for a moment, it appeared that Sudan maybe was the country that could. It was going to be the exception to the failures of the rest of the Arab Spring. And then, unfortunately, that's not how it happened. That's not how it played out. The democratic transition was difficult. Arguably, there probably wasn't enough support from the US and other countries during that fragile early period. And it quickly devolved into a contest between these two very powerful military leaders who had supported the coup initially, and then they seized power together, but then turned on each other, which led to the civil war that's tearing the country apart today.
And I want to come back to that conflict briefly, but the one thing that's clear is with the population boom and the resources available, Africa will be a defining region for as long as I'm alive. What countries are being what leaders in what countries are being proactive and finding ways to not have a disenfranchised youth population? And who do you think can come out on top based on the current policies today?
Honestly, I hesitate. I hate to
say no one.
I hate to say be pessimistic, but honestly, when you look around, so much depends on leadership. And there were previous periods in the 1990s where you could point to 4 or 5 African leaders who were really, taking charge in their regions, really, driving the pace of change, turning things upside down. Now you see it's very hard to look for a country where you've got a leader who is inspiring others. I mean, it's perhaps a little tragic to say, but the one figure who has captured the imaginations of certainly some young Africans is Ibrahim Traore, the military coup leader, this young army officer who's taken control in Burkina Faso. Whether he's brought real changes to his country is highly debatable. I mean, the insurgencies have actually pushed towards the capital since he's been in power. But for some reason, he's someone who, you see buzz on social media in other countries. Some young Africans anyway, are looking to him. And instead, we see, countries that were previously leaders look to South Africa, the biggest, one of the most important economies on the continent. And there we see in recent months, this very disturbing phenomenon of vigilante groups leading xenophobic attacks against people from other African countries who've come there largely for economic reasons, and driving them out. And we're seeing these extraordinary scenes of Nigeria and Ghana and several countries sending planes to West Africa to safely retrieve their own citizens and bring them home. So there is undoubtedly, I think, a leadership deficit at the moment that is, I think, draining some of the hope among young Africans about where things are going.
Well, what's the worst case scenario if that sort of sense of desperation and lack of economic opportunity persist into 2050 when Africa becomes 1 in 5 people? What would the continent look like if there's not true structural change in economic growth and reform?
I honestly think it's going to be a mixed picture. I don't think there's going to be one answer to that question across Africa. There will be, in any situation, there will be winners and there will be losers. But as journalists, I suppose we tend to look for not necessarily the extremes, but certainly the most, newsworthy aspects of that. And there really is a major concern about what's going to happen in the Sahel region in West Africa. Right now, we see this band of countries largely controlled by militaries. If those militaries were able to take control of the situations and improve the lot of people, I think they'd probably have some leeway in terms of, not providing democracy or not keeping to their promises to return the countries to democracy. But instead, we see them actually delivering very little to their own people. And I think that's got to be, if you were looking for a place to worry about, I think you'd probably be looking to that band that goes across northern Nigeria, Niger, Burkina Faso, and now actually all the way across into Chad, into Sudan, and almost to the other side of the continent, really, as far as Eritrea.
Yeah. Well, to your point, it seemed very possible that South Sudan could be a promising spot at one point. Now it's not. Azawad, though governed by terrorists, they were trying to make these promises as well. What conflicts will arise in the future that we're currently not focused on that keep you up at night? Like, what are the boiling points that could boil over and cause long-term harm?
The one to watch right now, and I think it has potentially huge implications on the African continent, perhaps even abroad in the Middle East, is in the Horn of Africa, and it's between Eritrea and Ethiopia. There have been these growing tensions between those two countries for over a year now. The leadership of Ethiopia has suggested in no uncertain terms that they would like Ethiopia is a landlocked country and that Ethiopia would like to have access to a port on the sea. And that seems to point almost unambiguously towards its old rival, Eritrea. Even though these two countries apparently made peace only 7 or 8 years ago, much of that seems to have fallen away now. And there are really very worrisome tensions. There are clashes going on in a border region called Tigray between the two. And if that conflict kicks off, that will not only, I think, that could not only plunge Ethiopia and Eritrea into turmoil, but also have a ripple effect across the Horn of Africa, probably into the war in Sudan, possibly into Somalia. And of course, right now, this is an area that is under huge scrutiny because now you're talking about the Red Sea into Yemen, and suddenly you're in the theater of the Iran war as well. So there is I think, a significant risk that you could see an eruption of conflict there that could have really unintended consequences across a much broader section of the world, of more than one continent than people realize right now.
Is my read on Abiy, the leader in Ethiopia right now, is my read correct in that he's a fairly ruthless individual who isn't going to play by the rules, and he could drive this conflict and drive it for some time? I don't believe he's that old.
He's very young, no, and of course, it's important to remember that Abiy Ahmed was the source of enormous hope only 7 or 8 years ago. This is the leader who made peace with Eritrea, with the dictatorial leader of Eritrea, Isaias Afwerki, and was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in, I think, 2019. The difficulty, of course, is that a year after that, in 2020, he went to war in Tigray, in this border region with Eritrea. And I think his reputation, certainly as a peacemaker, has taken has had serious setbacks since then. I will say that I covered that war in 2020 pretty extensively. At the time, there were certainly a lot of experts who seemed to think that Abiy had really overplayed his hand, bitten off more than he could chew, and that it was almost inevitable that he was going to come a cropper, as we would say, that he would suffer from the decisions he'd taken. Arguably, that's not how it panned out. He got out of that war in the end. There was a negotiated settlement. And he went on to, rebuild his economy to some degree, and to, crucially, coming back to our earlier point about these middle powers, really strengthen his relationship with the United Arab Emirates, which has become probably his most important foreign backer. The UAE now plays a huge role in Ethiopian foreign policy and support to the country and so on, investment opportunities. And so Abiy Ahmed is really a great survivor, and is proven to be, I would say, quite a mercurial leader. He's really made a virtue out of being quite unpredictable. So despite all the worries, I guess I would say, maybe on a positive note, despite all the worries about the potential for a war, it won't necessarily go to there with Eritrea, but he has made a career out of keeping people guessing. How that's going to end up for him and for his country in the end remains to be seen.
I keep wanting to come back to Sudan, but I would be remiss if I didn't just touch on a little more the UAE, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. Saudi, of course, had carried out a conflict in Yemen for 10 plus years. Turkey is continuing to have its own trouble, but to play in the region. And then, as we keep alluding to, the UAE is playing. Is their incentive right now only short-term economic growth, or do they see some sort of logic in this question of youth development, economic opportunity, for the sake of avoiding extremism? Because it seems to me that these middle powers in Saudi Arabia, which I think you could argue is a major power, are not particularly concerned today with fighting like offshoots of Al-Qaeda that they were 10 years ago, because they know they can just throw a few bombs and move on. They just want to extract resources and build companies. Or is that a little bit too reductive? Do they see a need to continue with promoting stability and economic growth for all, not just these large companies?
I think their motives are really mixed. I don't think terrorism per se is really high on the agenda anymore. I think at this point it's much more about resources. It's about strategic influence. It's about these Gulf countries waking up, actually, I think some years ago, and sort of feeling that this whole Horn of Africa part of region is part of their strategic backyard, and that they want to play an increasingly large role there. It's also about things like gold. Don't forget that there are but over 90% of the gold that's produced in Africa is traded through Dubai and the UAE. And to some degree, it is about politics. I mean, the approach of the foreign policy of the UAE since the Arab Spring has to some degree been dictated by this belief, this real hostility among the leaders of the UAE towards what we refer to as political Islam, towards the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. And that arguably determined which side they have taken in the war in Sudan. They are now backing the Rapid Support Forces, this paramilitary group, which is fighting against the Sudanese military. The Sudanese military historically has had, links with a version of the Muslim Brotherhood, let's say. And so we see the UAE taking the other side. I mean, the problem with that equation is that the RSF is the successor to the Janjaweed, which was this notorious militia responsible for the worst atrocities of the genocide in Darfur 20 years ago, and which has been accused of many of the same atrocities again, unfortunately, in this present war. And, it's been so fascinating to see on a reputational level how the Emirates has sought to manage this tension, if you like, because Dubai, as we know, is a place that is known to many people, certainly in the West. At least until the recent war in Iran, was known as a place of, a certain amount of glamour and money and prosperity. And at the same time, you've got it now pursuing this quite hawkish foreign policy in support of this group that has been accused credibly of genocide.
When looking a little more at Sudan, before I let you go, it seems likely that it could just permanently fragment into rival warlords and fiefdoms ruling the country. Do you have any hope that a strong central government can actually hold this country together, or are we looking at just a country with rival fiefdoms forever held together just through warlords conflicting and mediating? Or where will Sudan go?
That's a real danger at this point. I think there was a period after the war started in 2023 that the international community, including the US and others, missed, where, I think with concerted diplomatic action, there could have been a push to try and pull back this war and get the two warring sides, these two military factions, effectively back to the table. We've now gone far beyond that. And the problem with this war is that it's no longer just about these Sudanese actors. It's become enmeshed with the policies and objectives of a broad range of countries. I mean, we've spoken a lot about the Emirates, but you've got Saudi Arabia, you've got Turkey, you've got Iran, Egypt. All of these countries have, if not taken a side, at least supplied weapons to one side or the other, and they are certainly very influential. So, I don't want to be a Cassandra, but I think that there is a real prospect that the war in Sudan, spreads further beyond its borders. I mean, we're already seeing that happening in recent weeks. We've seen attacks inside Sudan that have come from secret bases that are inside Ethiopia. Similarly, we've seen things in Chad or in South Sudan earlier in this conflict. So I think there is a danger, unfortunately, of an unraveling. But like I said, I think to stop that, it's no longer just about the Sudanese themselves. It's about all of these other countries which have become so enmeshed in the conflict.
Well, my last question, be it, Cassandra, how bad could it get if the other countries don't actually intervene, and if it does become a permanent failed state with rival warlords leading it? How much worse could the suffering get compared to where it is today?
It's starting from a terrible place. There's already a famine underway in parts of the country. They're hard to know, but certainly hundreds of thousands of people who've died. It's very hard to quantify, how much worse it could get. But I think if you want to measure it in terms of stability for the region, that's got to be the next place to look. It's got to be whether this war ends up sucking in more countries or spreading over borders, and feeding into this belt of instability that, like I said, will not necessarily even just stay in Africa, could also have influence across the border or across the Red Sea, rather, in the Middle East.
We've hit on, of course, a lot of the issues and problems within the continent, from a young population without much economic hope, from the crisis in Sudan to Ebola to reckless leaders like Abiy to, well, everything. What gives you hope for the region and for the continent over the next 10 years and the next 25? You can say nothing. It would be depressing, but you could say nothing.
No, I actually don't agree. I mean, number one, I just meet endless people in even the worst of circumstances who are incredibly impressive, either in terms of their moral courage or in terms of their abilities in many, many ways. And, what is that except it's a reminder of like the incredible the incredible opportunities that are the incredible capacities and potential of this continent. We haven't in this conversation talked a lot about the places where, where the mineral industry is growing, where there are opportunities. Don't forget that underlying everything that we've described, human progress has been significant in Africa. Birth rates, maternal mortality has plunged. Health and education have improved. I mean, there are many ways to measure positive change, and some very impressive individuals in business or in politics or in other fields. So, I don't think it's all gloom. I think there's many ways, but unfortunately, the problem spots that are appearing right now are, inevitably what's absorbing our attention.
Well, that's a very good place to call it. But for our listeners, where can they continue to follow your reporting and your work, and how can they keep watching what you're up to?
In the New York Times, in the international pages. Yeah, I mean, I'm largely writing on Africa, sometimes on other places too, but mostly on Africa.
Very good. Well, Declan, thank you for joining.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Nathan.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time and share with friends.